Welcome to this webinar hosted by the 21st Century China Center. I'm Kwai, Professor of Sociology at UC San Diego. Thank you for joining our discussion today. This webinar is recorded and will be available on our website, china.ucsd.edu. Today, we're delighted to have Dr. Jessica Teets with us. Dr. Jessica Teets is an associate professor in the political science department at Middlebury College, an associate editor of the Journal of Chinese Political Science. Her research focuses on governance and political and policy diffusion in authoritarian regimes, specifically the role of civil society. She's the author of the book, Civil Society Under Authoritarianism, the Chinese Model, and co-editor of Local Governance Innovation in China, Experimentation, Diffusion, and Defiance. Dr. Teets was recently selected to participate in the public intellectual program created by the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and is currently researching policy experimentation by local governments in China. I would just add the journal, the China Quarterly, recently celebrated its 60th anniversary and by issuing a special issue. And on that special issue, there were a number of most influential articles selected by the issue. And Jessica's 2013 articles on consultative authoritarianism was among one of the articles selected. So we are very happy to have Jessica to be with us today to speak on the topic of civil society and social entrepreneurs. Please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen to submit your question. So after Jessica's presentation, I will start a conversation and then we will open it up for Q&A. And I'll be reading the questions you submit for Jessica during the Q&A time at the end of the presentation. So now a warm welcome, Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction and also for the invitation to speak. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There we go. And that came through. Good. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this topic of civil society and some of the challenges that civil society are facing in China as a foundation. But then I'd like to shift to a new format that we're seeing. And that's really what the research for today is focused on. I'm presenting today, but I also wanted to acknowledge my two co-authors who are also working on this project. So let me go ahead and jump right in. And for a lot of you, you might already know about the challenges that NGOs are facing. So I'll just go through this quickly, just so that everybody's on the same page. So what we see is that there are a couple of challenges that NGOs have been facing in China. One is registration. So even after registration was relaxed after 2016, so that NGOs no longer had to have a government supervisor, which was sometimes called a mother-in-law, they still have to register through the Ministry of Civil Affairs. And this is still a pretty challenging process for most groups. So we see this challenge with registration. We also see a challenge with funding. After 2016 and the legal changes that we saw with overseas or foreign NGOs, this restricted international funding, which for a lot of groups was the majority of their budget. So usually we saw that groups had in excess of 85% of their funding was coming through international sources. So they're now facing a funding challenge. And then the last challenge that these groups have been facing is more just confusion about what they are, what they do. And so, for example, I have friends who work in the NGO sector and their parents always think they work for free, that they're just volunteering their time. So the idea of an NGO as sort of a professional charity isn't really well understood. And there've also been several pretty high profile fraud cases where people were raising money and then using it for girlfriends, cars, those sorts of things. And then this joins in on the government side. That sort of confusion about what NGOs are doing. Are they fraudulent? Are they real? There's also a concern on the part of the government about all of the international linkages that these NGOs have. And does this mean that they have what oftentimes local officials call bad intentions, right? That they're going to try to democratize China, and that they're serving basically as Trojan horses for Western democratization interests. So this is the landscape of what we see civil society and NGOs facing in China historically, but I've tried to highlight what we see since 2016 and the legal changes that we saw. So in this sort of ecology of what the situation looks like for NGOs, what we see is that a number of NGOs, in response to these challenges with registration and funding, they're starting to switch their format away from an NGO and towards something called a social enterprise. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. But this research that, that Sean Ripley and I have been doing is really trying to look at this adaptation. And we're trying to understand, first of all, is this shift from NGO to social enterprise, is it working? So is it solving these funding and registration challenges? And if so, is this increasingly what civil society is going to look like in China, this sort of format? So that's the research question then that we're trying to tackle. And this is a really new topic. So this idea of social enterprises or social entrepreneurship, we see that it's introduced around 2013 by the British. That's why I have their flag in the corner. So a lot of people might know this already, but the British Embassy has sort of a think tank or consulting arm attached to it. I forget its exact name, but I always call it the Margaret Thatcher Institute because it focuses on like public-private partnerships, marketization, those sorts of things. And one of the programs that they launched in 2013 was introducing this idea of social enterprises or social entrepreneurship. And that's basically the idea that you form an organization to solve a social problem, but it's through a market-driven approach. And you can see that there are a number of formats that this can take, but regardless of which format it takes, what you're looking at is essentially a business that is supposed to be sustainable because it's not relying on donations or grants. And so all social enterprises need to do two things. They need to have social impact, so that has to be their main mission, their main focus, and they have to have financial sustainability, right? So they have to have some sort of market plan. So what that looks like then in China, again, remember, this is really new. So this is a concept introduced in 2013. And since then, we've seen that there have been a number of attempts to try to create some sort of standards around what social enterprises are. And we see that I've listed a couple of them for you that are looking more nationally, but we also see local government experimentation around social enterprises. And so I've listed those as well. And so in this space, we have some attempts to try to create a certification or a definition of what social enterprises are. But again, this is not very advanced at this point. We also see that that intermediary space of organizations supporting social entrepreneurs has been developing. And so this has been developing in two different ways. One is through capacity building entities. So these are, like I've listed below, the nonprofit incubator or ONPI. So for example, they used to incubate nonprofits, but now they also incubate social enterprises. So we see that sort of capacity building or incubation programs. We also, though, see in the area of funding that there's been a number of these venture philanthropy funds. So this is called venture philanthropy or social philanthropy. There's a number of different names, but basically what you see are either foundations or normal investment companies that normally would just be investing in market-based companies. They'll set up these special funds and they're looking to invest in social enterprises. So we do see the creation of this intermediary space too. And so what we see then in this space, so this is a survey. The images that I'm going to show are taken from a survey that NPI did, and I've linked to it on the final slide for those of you who'd like to go through it in more detail. But basically, if you look at this space, again, it's a really new space, right? So we're mostly looking at social enterprises that formed after 2016. So we're just looking at a very short time period here. And I just want that to be understood so that when I talk about what we're seeing, we can understand that we're in an early stage of development and things will likely change. We mostly see that the founders are young, urban, and educated, and you can see that in the demographic chart that I've shown here. Most of them, just like NGOs, are operating at the local level. So we only see about 17% of the groups that were surveyed operating at the national level. So that's what we see in this space. Now, as far as the development, again, I wanted to show this graphic just to show the age of most of the organizations that we're looking at. So again, these organizations haven't existed for very long, and they're also pretty small, right? So again, it's an emerging sector. And so everything I'm going to talk about as findings, I call initial findings, because this sector is developing really quickly. Okay, so what do we see in this sector? So I'll talk a little bit more about some of the interview evidence that we have, and so that I can sort of flesh out exactly what these groups are doing. But you can see that a lot of them are working with children and youth. And the dominant way that they're creating the sustainable financial model or their business model is through fee for services. So there are other formats, but you can see that the vast majority are using fee for services. So what I'd like to do is talk through some examples of this so you can see what fee for services look like, and you can also see what some of the programs are. One quick quote I wanted to share about this fee for service model is, and again, most of these social enterprises are NGOs that didn't used to charge for their services, and now they're starting to charge for their services in order to create this sustainable business model. So you can see this quote here, and I won't read it to you, but you can see that basically this founder is arguing that when users pay, you can focus on improving your product and providing better service, right? And so he's trying to make this argument that financial sustainability also means that they should offer better services. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is dive a little bit more deeply into the interview evidence and what we see in this space. So I sort of gave you the macro view of what it looks like. And now I want to look a little bit more at individual NGOs and how they are becoming social enterprises. So one model that we see, oh, and just I should give a quick note, Friends of Nature here, I'm using their name because this particular case was written up in the media, so everybody knows about it. But a lot of the other cases, we aren't using the organization's real names because we've been asked not to. The organizations are just worried about sensitivity. So I just wanted to note that. So the first path that we see then, this is when you have an existing NGO like Friends of Nature, and what they're doing is using some of their revenue streams. In this particular case, these are those legal cases against polluting companies. So when Friends of Nature are winning these cases, they're using that compensation and they're creating this nature education program. It's basically a school for nature education. So you have the NGO, Friends of Nature, that is continuing to exist, and they're creating these small social enterprises like the school inside of the NGO organization. So that's one pathway that we see. The other pathway that we see, I've kind of called a social enterprise conglomerate because, and again, this is not the group's real name, but basically what you see with this model is that you continue to have the NGO, then you also create maybe one social enterprise, maybe more, that do similar things, but maybe are slightly different. So you're sharing resources, you're sharing a lot of ideas and maybe even staff, but you have different sort of silos inside of the same organization. One is the original NGO, but the others are these new social enterprises. And so you can see that this group is setting up, working on inclusive mental health, and also thinking about launching another social enterprise to contract with companies to work on workplace diversity. And so what you're seeing then is sort of this conglomerate, right? The NGO is just one part of the overall organization. The third path that we see, this is that transition from we used to be an NGO, but we're not able to function like that anymore. So we're going to relaunch ourselves, same staff, same mission, but we're going to relaunch ourselves as a social enterprise. And again, this isn't the real name of the group, but basically what we see is that an organization was shut down, but the team members took that same mission and they relaunched themselves as a social enterprise. So this is transitioning from the NGO to a social enterprise. The NGO no longer exists. And then the fourth pathway that we see, and again, there's a lot of diversity in this space, but we are seeing these as the four main pathways. The other pathway that we see is this substitution. And this is that people who are interested in launching an NGO decide not to launch it in that format. And instead they take their idea, the social problem that they want to address, the space in which they want to work, and they form themselves from day one as a social enterprise. And here's, an example of another group, again, not its real name. So these are the four different pathways that we see. And so you can see that there's a lot of diversity in this space. It's emerging and it's developing pretty quickly. So what do we find? So remember, we were looking at those big challenges, right? The registration and the funding challenges, and asking, does this adaptation of those four different pathways, does that solve the problem? And what we see is that, yes, registration is a lot easier with Ministry of Commerce than it is with Ministry of Civil Affairs, right? So at the local level where most of these groups are registering, the Bureau of Commerce is happy to have more businesses registering with them, right? Employing more people, bringing in more tax revenue. So that's a particular part of the government that's encouraged to have more groups, unlike the Ministry of Civil Affairs, right? So we see that it is in fact easier to register, but because of the format in which they're registering, a lot of times they have to pay taxes on their revenue, and sometimes they're not qualifying for these public fundraising platforms. So basically what we find through our interviews with these groups is that there is an advantage from the point of registration to registering as a social enterprise and not an NGO. But we do see that there are these restrictions on fundraising, including having to pay taxes on revenue. And so this is one area where we see that a lot of the groups that we've talked to, they point out that this is where they need policy change. So they need a different type of tax status. Okay, what about funding? So the second challenge was funding. And what we're seeing with funding is that there is a lot more diversity in funding sources. So part of this is coming through local government contracting. So as the government contracts out to these providers, they can contract to NGOs, but also to social enterprises. And we see that social enterprises are in fact bidding for these services. We also see that crowdfunding is growing. This chart was taken from Kelly Tsai's article, which again, I've linked to in the final slide for those of you who are interested in reading more. But you can see that this chart is looking at crowdfunding. You can see total donations, total percentage of the total. And so if you look at those columns, you can see that in some areas like children's welfare, this is already a third of income. So we do see that crowdfunding is really opening up a lot of revenue sources for these groups. But again, usually it's the more established, bigger organizations that are benefiting the most. We do see the creation of those social impact funds that I talked about before, but again, this is still a really small source of funding. We would expect that this would grow over time, but right now it's accounting for about 20% of funding at the maximum. So mostly what we see then with funding for these organizations is that fee-for-service model. And so this is where you're charging a fee for your project services. So this could be either to individuals, right? So like that quote that we looked at for the counseling service. So for example, if you're doing disability services and you're running a school, you could charge the families a fee. So there's that, and you can see that's about 28% of who's paying these fees. A lot are from the government, again, doing contracting, but also increasingly we see this, this category of social enterprise working closely with businesses. So workplace diversity programs, all sorts of programs that we see then that companies are working with, whether it's part of sort of corporate social responsibility programs or if it's actually services for their workforce. That's a really large part of this funding that we see. So overall, what we see is that in this challenge of funding, it's still really challenging, right? So it's not replacing the lost money that we see from international grants. But we are seeing that there is some funding here, and there's diversified funding sources. So it's coming in through a number of different channels. But we also see that, especially for the NGOs that have turned into social enterprises, they're not really all that competitive on the market. And this probably makes sense, right? If you form an NGO because you see a social challenge, you're thinking usually in that kind of nonprofit mentality. You're not necessarily a business person. So this is one of the challenges then that we see. So overall, if we go back to our question about has this adaptation been successful, what we're seeing, and again, this is, these are just initial conclusions because this is a rapidly evolving space, but we see that the registration challenge is addressed through this particular adaptation, but we're not really seeing the same sort of success with funding. This is still a challenge. One of the examples, and this has been written about through like the China Development Brief and a number of other news sources, but for example, Huiling, for those of you from Beijing who are familiar with this organization, for their disability services program, they tried to launch a number of bakeries that they would have their students work at with the idea that those bakeries would raise enough money to fund their other programming. But they're not finding that to be the case. They're actually losing money. So what we see in this sector is that of those 4 pathways that we looked at, it's mostly the social enterprises that are launching as social enterprises that are the most successful, because what they're doing with their model is inside of their model, it has both the social mission as well as the sustainable business model. And so those are the most successful out of those 4 pathways. For the NGOs that are trying to use social entrepreneurship as a way to generate revenue, but keep everything else the same, we're not seeing the same kind of success. So what we find is that this sector needs more development, and I'll share a couple of areas that we found in interviews and surveys that they need to work on, but also just that this is not going to be a successful strategy for all NGOs. So the idea of, is this going to become what civil society looks like in China? I don't think that that's what we're going to see. I think we're going to see the continuation of NGOs, as well as this sort of new emerging sector of social enterprises. And this is last slide is just looking at what we found. So the first image is from that NPI survey, the nonprofit incubator survey that I had talked about earlier. And then the other, the bullet points are looking at things that we figured out through our interviews. But you can see that this sector needs a lot of development, right? So there are lots of concerns about how these groups can create a sustainable business model. So something that raises money versus loses money. Are there existing markets for the types of products and services that they're launching? So if you're doing workplace diversity or anti-harassment training, how big is that market? Is that enough for a group to survive on for their funding? We also see that this is a risk. So this is not a costless shift. In fact, we see that for a lot of NGOs, what they have to do is divert funding from their programs and their staff in order to develop these new programs and hire new people. So there is a potential loss here. And then we see this a lot with organizations that started as NGOs and are trying to transition into social enterprises, is this idea of how do you balance the needs of the market with your social goals, right? So you don't want to just become a company. That's not the point of this. So how do you balance those two things? And then the rest of the concerns that we saw were mostly about how do you deal with this new structure and how do you make sure that your staff can handle this new structure? Because again, there aren't a lot of models yet. So I'll go ahead and end there. And these are a couple of sources for people who are interested in reading more about this new sector, including the last one is the survey that I used images from. So thank you, and I look forward to everybody's questions.
Oh, thank you, Jessica, for this very interesting and insightful presentation. I've seen quite a lot of questions from our attendants already. But before I open up the floor, I want to take advantage of my role as the moderator to ask you a couple of questions. So I guess the first question I have is, well, we know the shift. It is because of the 2016 law, and the idea is to divert the Chinese NGOs or social enterprise away from foreign NGOs agenda. So now you are seeing this kind of new types of enterprise coming up. How would you comment on the shift? And I know this is not your focus, but can you comment a little bit about, does the 2016 law achieve its purpose? I mean, do you see a kind of sea change or some kind of gradual change in terms of the quote unquote service provided by the enterprises? So that's my number one question. And then my second question is, I'm really intrigued by your categories of social enterprises. I wanted to ask, one category is a relaunch, and that seems to me quite an obvious, really relaunch. I mean, basically, old wine in a new bottle. Would they experience again the same pushback from local governments? How many social enterprises are just, old wine in new bottle? Can you comment?
Right.
Or are there actually more substitution on the way, and that lead to a change in the nature of the services offered by this particular group of NGO / social enterprise?
Yeah, so I would be happy to answer both of those questions. And my co-author, Shanxie, is on the call, and he noted in the chat that my nickname of the Margaret Thatcher Institute is wrong. It was the British Council. So thank you for correcting me. So I guess your big question, I can answer that one first about the NGO law and was it successful? And I think that it was largely in that the link that we saw developing between domestic groups and international groups has largely been broken. So what you used to see as far as large organizations like Oxfam or an organization like that, where they would go into a local area, they would want to run a project, and they would you sort of outsource different parts of it to local groups. And then together with a number of those groups, they would work on those projects. Or things like Ford Foundation and their funding for capacity building. So most of those programs are no longer working. If you're a foreign NGO, you can try to work with a local group, and there are probably a lot of people on the webinar who might have different experiences, but what I've heard from the groups that I work with more closely in Yunnan is that if you put a proposal like that forward, where you say that you want to work with local groups, there's a lot more scrutiny, and oftentimes you're not told no, but you're not given approval for your project either. It just sort of sits on somebody's desk until you decide you have to move on. And so it seems that sort of linkage, or that building up of an ecosystem where the foreign groups were working a lot with the domestic groups and were sort of guiding them and developing capacity, I think that the law has been successful in splitting that apart into a sort of firmly foreign NGO sector and a domestic NGO sector. And so if that was the intention of the law, I think that that part of it has been really successful. Also, if the intention was to make sure that local groups were collaborating much more closely with the government, that's also been successful, because losing that funding stream for international grants and international projects has meant that they're doing more local government contracting, which is bringing them into local government offices. They're bidding for projects, they're talking about the projects as they develop. And so there is a lot more collaboration and communication. So I think that we do see some successes there, if those were the intentions of the law. As far as the old wine in new bottles, from what I've seen, and again, there could be other people on the webinar who've seen different groups and might have different perspectives, but from what I've seen, it doesn't seem to be a problem. It doesn't seem like Ministry of Civil Affairs and Ministry of Commerce talk all that much, even at the local level. And so the groups that I've talked to who've registered no longer as an NGO, but have switched their registration to commerce, they haven't reported any problems, like anyone saying to them, hey, you used to be an NGO and now you want to be a social enterprise. You know, isn't that sort of doing an end run around the registration process? It basically seems to be a pretty welcoming environment, in that if you want to register your social enterprise and you want to pay taxes and hire local people, that commerce is happy to have you. So I don't see that same sort of scrutiny. And it could be due to the fact that these are two different organizations tasked with different things. You know, one is trying to raise local revenue and development, and the other is, you know, paying attention to civil affairs and social stability. So that could be part of it. It also might be that in China, with the state-owned enterprise sector, and then before that, you know, lineage and clan-based associations, this idea of having commercial businesses or commercial enterprises that then have a social mission, or they work for the community's social outcomes, that seems to be a status that everyone just understands a lot better. So for the groups that I've talked to, and these are mostly in the environmental sector in Yunnan, but for most of them, the idea of like running a school is welcomed in a way that doing environmental education as an NGO wasn't. So that's sort of suspicion of what's your real purpose, what's your real intention, doesn't seem to be there. So that's mostly what I'm seeing.
Well, thank you. There are many questions. Please be patient. I'll try my best to group questions together. So there is a group of questions that are really concerned about the fate of the marginal communities in China, and how this particular change would actually has an adverse impact on them. So let me ask group those questions together. Harris, for example, he asked, what kind of costs, you know, when we are talking about this kind of like cost NGOs, what kind of costs are left by the wayside? And what kind of costs are now picked up and seem to do well continuously under the new regime. And I guess, you know, looking at the table you produce, some of the services provided under this new system, they seem to be some basic fundamental government service. They are now contracted out, like healthcare, care for elderly, education, so on and so forth. But with the exception of perhaps the environment, I don't see a lot of like cost NGOs in the new regime. So would the marginal communities be kind of like ignored as a result? That's number one. And then the second question is that, this is basically to repeat the point that I just made. Are you seeing a fragmentation of services from and a decrease in availability of services provided to marginalized communities? I'm curious because you said many SE founders are young and urban, And second, the fee-for-service model could potentially exclude them, those most at need. And this is posed by Jisa Dang.
Yeah. So I guess more broadly, what we see with NGOs in China after the series of 2016, 2017 laws is that I think that those are exactly the type of groups who were most impacted. So sort of smaller rights-based groups, like a lot of the groups that I would talk to in Yunnan were sort of men sleeping with men groups. They were doing local AIDS education, running clinics. Those sorts of groups they found it really challenging to exist in this new world. So they had trouble getting registered with the Ministry of Civil Affairs. They also then lost their main funding sources. So with, the Global Fund pulling out of China and all of that foreign funding going away, it means that you need the government to contract with you, or you have to do a fee for services. And it's simply, I would say that a lot of these organizations just haven't been able to make the transition. And then, so that's one category. The other category are these smaller, a lot of them are rights-based organizations working with vulnerable populations. For those organizations, the ones that still existed, what they've done is, I think that they have embraced the social enterprise space more because they feel that there's more freedom, more space in that sector. So again, the kind of scrutiny that they get from civil affairs, they're not getting from commerce as long as they, pay their taxes. So they're not getting the same kind of scrutiny as far as what their programming is and all of those sorts of things. But the bigger question that they're facing is there a market for their services that can actually pay for these things? So for some of them, they're able to contract with the government. So, certain disability programs and things like that, they're able to get municipal grants. And so they're able to run those programs with small or zero contributions from the family. But for others, the idea of what sort of space is there for feminist issues or, lesbian gay populations? Is there a big enough market there that you would be able to fund your organization through social entrepreneurship? And that's sort of an open question that a lot of the groups that we've spoken with have. So far, they have managed to do some sort of workplace diversity trainings and programs like that. So we do see some of that, but it's not a large space. So again, they're competing for a pretty small amount of funding, and that's really a challenge. So what I see is that these laws really bifurcated domestic NGOs. The bigger groups haven't really had that many problems in finding other funding sources, doing contracting, doing crowdfunding. But those smaller, more community-based groups, those are the groups that have found this really challenging.
Okay. Another list of another group of questions is about, I would say, and I'm going to use my interpretive liberty to suggest that they focus on the conglomerates that you talk about. So they wanted to ask, is the bringing in of NGOs within the framework of social enterprise subtly shift the nature or the mission of NGOs? And there are some specific questions about, is there evidence of a mission drift when NGOs shift into this particular sector? And Joanna Capish, she asks, are you aware that NGOs are not allowed to cooperate with certain SEs?
Yeah, so this is one of the big concerns that we've seen also with groups who are trying to create social enterprises or else transition from an NGO to a social enterprise, is that idea of mission drift is really problematic. So the pathway that we saw where groups, instead of forming an NGO, they pick to become a social enterprise instead, they don't really seem to have those same sort of problems because they figured out what their balance is between the business or the self-sustaining part as well as the social impact. So, a model like that, like Tom shoes, which a lot of us in the US are familiar with, where you buy one of their shoes and they give another pair to somebody in need. Those sorts of business plans, the social impact and the sustainability are built into the organization from the very beginning. So they don't seem to face as many of these concerns. But the other three pathways, most of those organizations are concerned with mission drift. So one part is, if you divert key money or people away from the work that they're already doing into creating this social enterprise, is that actually the best way to use those resources? And then there's also sort of the question of, if we try to become a social enterprise, are we basically just becoming a company and our social impact is, small to non-existent, which isn't why they created the organization, and it's not why their staff are working there. So that is a really big challenge that we see with these organizations, is trying to figure out how to have that balance if that balance wasn't part of your overall organizational structure when you first formed.
Right. I mean, it's always complicated when you interact with the external environment. And I have a question about, not so much about, the changing nature or the giving up of their mission goals among NGOs. Is quite the opposite. What about new opportunities? Are there any opportunities for coalition and strategy for coalition among NGOs with the new social?
Yeah, we are seeing that, and I think that's really interesting. I didn't cover that as much in my presentation because that's something that's just now emerging, and I don't feel like I have a really good handle on exactly what that space looks like. But we're starting to see that sort of intermediary space. So different organizations like NPI, creating these social enterprise incubators, different funds that are starting up to direct funding to these new social enterprises, but then also other services like lawyers who are willing to work with them in order to, help them fill out their paperwork or do things like that. So we are seeing that there's a lot of collaboration in this space with social enterprises, either collaboration to support them and get them off the ground, or collaboration with developing their programs and their services and their offerings. So we do see a lot of collaboration in that space. And personally, that's one of the things that I find really encouraging, is to watch that sort of intermediary space build up, because I think that that's one of the missing supports, that if you're going to have a really well-developed social enterprise sector in China, you need to have these funding mechanisms and you need to have these other supports. So seeing that develop makes me feel hopeful.
And do you think it is much easier to register now under the new system? There are a couple of questions about, is it a form of a registration process or a certification process? Can you say something on the new process?
Yeah, so for the social enterprises themselves, there isn't a national certification or registration process. There are a lot of groups that are trying to work on that and what that would look like. Some of these certification processes are trying to borrow heavily from the British model, as well as other European countries that have certification programs. So they're trying to develop that, but it doesn't exist right now. So when these social enterprises are registering, they're registering with Commerce, and they're just registering as a business. So again, that idea that they're a business with a social mission is sort of seen as, sure, right? Like we have a state-owned enterprise sector, so we understand that mixture of social mission with, a business goal. And so, at least from my understanding of the process, it's fairly straightforward to register with Commerce, especially because of all the rounds of administrative approvals. So, reducing the number of signatures that you have, reducing the wait time that you need in order to get your permits. So that process seems fairly easy. But again, there's no separate certification process for social enterprises on a national level yet. So this is simply just registering as a business.
Right. Well, okay. Well, that's a pretty flexible system. It kind of like remind me about ESG investment in this country. I mean, it means different things for different people, and I'm wondering if uh, actually what kind of like companies are excluded from the from the heading of a social enterprise is not clear at all.
Yeah, it's not clear. I mean, ideally, you would say that you have to have a social mission. So not just like corporate social responsibility where you run your business and then your employees volunteer, every weekend a certain number of hours, that the social mission, that the social goal has to be the mission, right? It has to be what the company is formed around. It has to be the main purpose. And then it also has to have some sort of business model or financial sustainability. And so that's what almost all of the certification programs look for. But again, what sort of legal language is used, what the tax status is, that does differ across different countries. So we would have to see what China adopted. But right now there isn't a national certification. So that's still in progress.
Right. And I think it's also important to add that even if it's just governed by the market logic, that doesn't mean that those social enterprise can operate without the scrutiny and sometimes the supervision of the government, as we have seen recently what happened to the private tutoring industry in China.
Absolutely. This is not protection from any sort of surveillance or scrutiny. It's just that the types of scrutiny that commerce uses versus civil affairs are different.
Right.
So, for commerce, they're not necessarily looking all that closely at all the different businesses that are registered in their area. Their incentive is to have more businesses registered, collect more tax money, and have more local people hired and employed by these businesses. And so that sort of incentive is, the more the better, versus civil affairs, which, of course they do approve organizations. There are millions of, registered NGOs in China, but I would say that they're focus is not necessarily the more the merrier, right? It's pretty challenging to get registered through civil affairs.
Right, right. I have a question from Lei Guang. He asked, there was a mushrooming of think tanks in recent years. So some were actually funded by private sectors and many receiving partial or complete government funding. So where are you going to put these organizations in your grid?
Yeah, so we don't really count them as social enterprises because they're not necessarily trying to resolve a social problem like poverty or environmental degradation. They're focusing more on providing, research or consulting services or something like that to policymakers. So, from my perspective, they definitely belong, or they can belong, in a civil society space, but we don't see them as social enterprises. So they don't really belong there. It will be interesting, though, to see how many of these think tanks make it. So, this mushrooming we saw after Xi Jinping called for the development of, a think tank sector that sort of rivaled what we see in places like the US. And we did see a proliferation of those. It isn't clear to me if all of them will eventually be successful. So I guess it depends on, how big they're supposed to get or how successful they're supposed to be. But again, we don't really count them as social enterprises. So I didn't look at them for this particular project.
Okay, this is the perfect segue to my next question. May Farid, she said, well, thanks for a very thought-provoking presentation. And she wanted to ask you, what explains variation in adaptation? I guess, the question means if you are going to predict which kind of organizations are likely to succeed under the new rules and which are likely going to struggle. What kind of organizations would you identify in both groups? And what organizations are more likely to adapt and maintain their NGO or organizational identity, and why?
Yeah, I mean, this space is really challenging and really new. And so at least what I'm seeing is that there isn't exactly a strategy like where the NGO sort of sits down and says, here are our attributes, so we should choose this type of form. Instead, it seems to be very opportunistic. So one of the examples, was looking at working with a consulting group who sort of came up with this suggestion for a model, and they tried it out. Um, a lot of the bakeries, the number of disability or addiction counseling NGOs that open bakeries. I think it was just because they like bakeries, right? They like going to places where they can sit and drink coffee. And it seems like it was a rapidly proliferating business, lots of cafes. And so it would be something that they could do fairly easily. There were some good international models of how that had worked, like Daytop in the United States. So really what I'm seeing is not so much a strategy as sort of an opportunistic response to saying we're having a really hard time in this space right now, either getting registered or staying registered, or getting funding. And is there something that we could do in this space? And so the groups that I've been talking to, most of them are talking to each other and sharing experiences as well. The people who work in the sort of intermediary organizations that we talked about that are incubating social enterprises, they also are sharing what they're finding. So they're talking about models that people are trying and what they're seeing with these different models. And so I think there's a lot of information and a lot of possibility out there, but not a lot of certainty. So I don't think we've seen any sort of coalescence around, if you're this type of NGO, here's something you could do and this would work. So it seems a little bit more like trial and error right now, where people are trying to use this space where they think that they can, register more easily, get more funding. But I haven't really seen any sort of discussion about, if you're this type of organization, this is the format that will work for you. And instead, it seems more like learning through failure. So we're sort of in that stage of development, right? A lot of these organizations are, 5 years old. And so they've tried these approaches. Some of them now are going back to the drawing board. I was just talking to a group that works in Yunnan in the environmental space, and they had been trying to run a program to bring college students for their spring break to Yunnan to work in the environmental sector. And they just weren't able to compete. There's so many social enterprises that are doing exactly that right now, and a lot of them are closer to the big cities. So like Anhui, there are a number of groups in Anhui that are taking advantage of college students in Shanghai that can come and do these programs. And so I think that, it's this trial and error process is what we're seeing right now. And so we probably won't see any sort of consolidation for a while yet.
We are almost at time. There are two questions that are related, and I want to ask them. One is by Margot Lemon, and she asks, "Do you have any sense whether social enterprise can and will be able to collaborate with foreign NGOs? Would it be less sensitive to do so for domestic NGOs?" And then the second question is kind of like related, and by Michael Obuskin. He asked, there used to be NGOs, government organized NGOs, channeling international funding from foreign donors to local projects and NGOs, thereby turning foreign funding into local donations. Is that still possible under the new arrangement?
So a lot of the groups that I've talked to aren't getting any sort of foreign funding. So they're mostly getting domestic funding. So, crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, doing government contracting, the fee for service model. So that's mostly what I'm seeing. I'm not seeing a lot of collaboration. I don't know if it would be easier for foreign NGOs to try to collaborate more with social enterprises. for the foreign NGO, they still have to approve their activities. So they still have to file their activities and get approval for those. So I'm not sure if groups have tried it and if that's raised red flags for them. I mean, my sense is that they're really, the government in China is really trying to keep these two spheres apart from each other and create an indigenous source of funding for social enterprises and NGOs. So I would suspect that if you tried to propose doing a project with a social enterprise, a domestic Chinese social enterprise, that you might face some of those same constraints. But I haven't heard any examples of people doing that yet.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. We still have a lot of questions on the chat. And there are a number of grad students, PhDs who have done similar projects, and they all want to connect with you, Jessica. I will leave it to you to communicate with them directly. So for now, I just want to say thank you very much for being with us. This webinar will be available in the next few days on our website, china.ucsd.edu. And please join us for our many exciting public webinars in the new year. So for now, we wish you a safe and joyful holiday and see you in the new year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.